I have been asked now and again in these later years whether I ever forgave my father. People ask it gently, the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer will not please you. My granddaughter asked me last spring, and I could see on her face that she hoped I would say yes, that she hoped I would tell her that time had softened the matter, that old age had brought me to a more charitable view of things. I did not tell her yes. I could not bring myself to offer her that comfort, because it would not have been true, and I have never been a woman who found it easy to speak what is not true. So I told her I would think on it, and I have thought on it, and here is what I have to say. I was born in the spring of 1842 in Muskingum County, Ohio, on a farm my father's family had worked since the early part of the century. My grandfather came west from Pennsylvania sometime around 1810 or thereabouts. He was of the old Quaker country, though he had long since left that faith behind. The farm was some 60 acres of good bottom land along a tributary of the Muskingum River, and my father, Elias Proctor, inherited it when my grandfather died in 1837, 5 years before I was born. By that time my father had already established himself not merely as a farmer, but also as a merchant operating a dry goods store in Zanesville itself. He was well regarded in the community. Men spoke well of him at the Mechanics' Institute. He served on the vestry of our church. By every appearance from the outside, he was a respectable and considerable man. That was the outside. There is always an inside. I am the second of 5 children. My eldest brother, Nathan, was born in 1839. Then there was me. Then came my sister Louisa, born in 1845, who died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1858. She was 13, and her death nearly undid my mother entirely. Then my younger brother, Calvin, born in 1848, and the youngest, Ida, born in 1852. Of those 5, 4 of us reached old age. Nathan passed away in 1921 at 82. Calvin has been gone since 1915. Ida lived until 1926. I am, as I speak, in The Last of Us. I am 90 years of age. No, I am 88. I lose count sometimes. 88 years. My mother's name was Agnes Proctor N. Holt, and if I am to speak of my father, I must first speak of her, because she is the central reason I cannot find it in myself to forgive him. She was a woman of quiet dignity, and I believe she was in her youth a woman of considerable hope. She had been reasonably well schooled for a girl of her era, and she read with genuine pleasure, not merely the Bible, which she knew almost by heart, but also history and poetry. Whatever she could obtain. In our county, there was not always much to obtain, but what there was, she read. She was not given to complaint. I never once heard her complain about the work, though it was considerable. 6 days of unceasing labor keeping house, preserving food, tending the kitchen garden, raising 5 children, assisting my father with his ledger when he required it. She bore it all with a steadiness that I have since come to understand was not ease of disposition, but the result of long practice in endurance. These are different things. The first is a gift. The second is something harder. The farm was beautiful. I wish to say that because it is true, and because I do not want everything I say to carry the shadow of what I am about to describe. Spring, when the flooding receded and the fields dried and my father plowed them, he did still work the farm, though the store was his primary occupation. There was a smell to the turned earth that I have never found words adequate to describe. The corn grew tall in summer, taller than my father, taller than Nathan when he was fully grown. We kept a kitchen garden of perhaps half an acre, and in late summer, the squash and bean rows, and the tomatoes coming ripe, would occupy nearly every hour of my mother's day. We put up preserves enough to fill the entire cellar. I have preserved food myself every summer of my married life, and I still take some pleasure in the rows of jars. It is a satisfaction of a practical sort that I believe women of a certain generation understand without needing explanation. The winters were long. That is something people do not always speak of when they speak of farm life, but it is the truth. 6 months nearly of cold and short days, with the animals requiring twice the attention and the household shut in upon itself. My mother read in the evenings, when the light lasted and the work allowed. She read to us children from whatever was available, the Bible, naturally, some poets, and whatever newspapers and periodicals made their way to the county. She had somewhere obtained a copy of one of Mr. Taper's Dickens novels, and she read it to us one winter when I was perhaps 10, a chapter at a time in the evenings, and I can still hear her voice reading those words, by lamplight. My father did not read. He sat in the evenings and tended to his accounts, or spoke with neighbors who called. And on the evenings he returned from Zanesville in the state I have described. He did not, either. What she endured I did not fully comprehend as a child. Children rarely do. You observe things without having the understanding necessary to name them. I observed, for instance, that my father returned late from Zanesville several evenings each week, and that, on those evenings, my mother's face took on a particular quality, a careful, watchful quality. I observed that she would send us children to bed early on those evenings, and that there were occasionally voices raised behind to the closed parlor door. Not shouting. My father was not on the whole a shouter, but a raised voice in a quiet house carries through the walls, especially when a child is lying still in the dark, listening for it. I did not know when I was 7 or 8 years of age what inebriation was. I did not know the word, and I certainly did not comprehend the thing itself. My father drank. He kept it within limits in his public life. I do not believe the men at the Mechanics' Institute knew the extent of it, and the congregation at church certainly did not. But at home, in the evenings, in the privacy of our household, the limits were loosened. He was not violent. I wish to be precise about this because I have no interest in exaggeration or painting a picture more lurid than the truth warrants. He did not strike my mother, not that I ever witnessed, nor that she ever indicated to me. What he did was something that leaves, in some respects, fewer marks, but no fewer wounds. He was cruel with words. He was contemptuous. He told my mother on many occasions, so that I could hear, that she was a poor manager, that the house was insufficient, that she had failed to be what he had expected in a wife. He said these things in the tone of a man correcting a servant, without pronounced anger, almost without feeling, as if the diminishment were merely a matter of state. In fact, my mother received these remarks in silence, and in the morning she rose before dawn and began the day's work as though nothing had been said. I believe that silence cost her a great deal. I believe it cost her more than she ever allowed herself to reckon. I do not know precisely when I began to understand what I was observing. Perhaps when I was 12 or 13, when I had enough experience of other households to realize that our evenings were not like evenings in every house. Perhaps it was after Louisa died, when I was 16. My mother's grief at losing Louisa was profound and long, as it ought to have been. Louisa was a sweet-natured child, and her illness was swift and terrible. Her loss left a vacancy in our family that was never filled. My father's response to that grief, I will say plainly, was inadequate. He was sorrowful in the manner of a man who has been inconvenienced. He attended the burial. He made the appropriate expressions of mourning at church, and within a fortnight he returned to his ordinary habits, without discernible change. My mother grieved for years. I watched her grieve, and I watched my father observe her grief from a distance, as if it were a weather condition outside the window, present, acknowledged, but entirely not his concern. By the time the war came in 1861, I was 19. My brother Nathan was 22, and he enlisted that spring. He served with the 73rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, if I recall correctly. Though I may misremember the regiment number, he was gone by summer. My father was 51 by then, which placed him beyond the range of conscription. The draft, as it was eventually organized, called for men between 20 and 45, and my father was past that. In any case, early enlistment was entirely voluntary. He did not volunteer. I do not say this as a criticism of a man of his years. Many men of 50 could not have served, and many had legitimate reason to remain with their families and livelihoods. I say it merely as a statement of fact, and to provide context for what I observe next. What I observe next is this. He spoke. Oh, how he spoke. At the Mechanics' Institute, at church, in the stores and counting houses of Zanesville. My father spoke with considerable vigor about the Union cause, about the necessity of sacrifice, about the honor of those who answered the nation's call. He spoke about it at our dinner table. He answered the nation's call. He spoke about it at our dinner table. He was, as far as the community could apprehend, a patriot of the most vocal sort. And yet, when the county conducted subscription drives to raise funds for the relief of soldiers' families, my father contributed modestly. And but once, when the hospital committee sought volunteers to help care for the wounded returned to Ohio, he was never present. His patriotism was entirely of the verbal variety. Nathan lay in a hospital tent in Georgia with a ball through his shoulder, and my father was holding forth at the Mechanics' Institute about the sacred cause. That tension did not lessen my regard for him. If anything, it deepened a feeling I had already begun to notice, a sense of him that I could not in good conscience ignore. Nathan came home in 1864. He had been wounded at the engagement near Osaka in Georgia in May of that year. A bullet had passed through his left shoulder, and though he recovered enough to walk and work, the shoulder never fully regained its strength. He was discharged and sent north. When he arrived at our door, he was thinner than I had ever seen a man, with a look in his eyes I could only describe as a kind of absence, as if some part of him had remained on those red Georgia hillsides and had not come home with the rest of him. He did not speak much about what he had seen. I asked him once directly what it had been like, and he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Nellie, there are things a man cannot put into words without harming the listener." I did not ask again. There was another challenge in Nathan's return that I did not fully understand at the time, but have come to see more clearly as I grew older. He came back to my father's house, the family home and farm. What he found there was mostly the same house he had left, with the same man acting in the same way. Nathan had endured 2 years of campaigning, had been shot, had watched men he knew die on the battlefield, had marched through rain, mud, and Georgia heat, and he returned to find his father giving talks at the Mechanics' Institute about the Sacred Union cause and contributing modestly to the relief funds. I believe that contrast troubled Nathan for many years. I know it did, because he told me so in his old age, when he no longer concerned himself with tact. He said that coming home to find my father precisely as he had been, unchanged, unmarked, prosperous, was one of the stranger and more disorienting experiences of his life. He regained some of his health in time. The emptiness in his eyes lessened, though it never entirely disappeared. He married in 1866, a good woman from Corsacton County, and I believe in the fullness of years he found some peace, though the shoulder ate him to the end. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never appear on YouTube. These are voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. I was married in November of 1864 to Thomas Whitfield, whose family I had known since childhood. His father ran the mill on the east branch of the creek, and our families had been acquainted for many years. I was 22 at my marriage, somewhat later than most women in our part of Ohio at the time. Usually, a young woman might marry at 17 or 18, and 20 was not considered early. 22 was not considered early. 22 was later than usual, and I knew it, but the war had disrupted many ordinary things, and Thomas had himself served briefly. He was discharged in the autumn of '63 because a fever had damaged his constitution enough that the army would not keep him. When he returned and resumed work at the mill, we renewed our acquaintance, and the matter was settled fairly quickly after that. We were married in my parents' parlor, and my mother wept with what I believed then was happiness. I hope it was happiness. I hope it was happiness. I hope at least some of it was genuine. Thomas was a good man. I want to be clear about this, because I am about to speak at length about a man who was not, and I do not wish the contrast to suggest I thought poorly of men in general. Thomas was steady and kind. He did not drink excessively. He never spoke to me with contempt in our 39 years of marriage until he died of pneumonia in 193. He never made me feel as my mother had been made to feel. I understood that difference early in our marriage. The contrast between what I had grown up seeing and what I was now living made me realize clearly how unnecessary my mother's suffering had been. Not inevitable, not the natural state of marriage, not something all women must accept. Unnecessary, produced by the character of one particular man, and therefore not the character of men in general, and therefore something that should never have been accepted as unchangeable. I knew that too late for my mother, but in time to benefit myself. We had 8 children. I will tell of them plainly, as is honest. James was the eldest, born in 1865. Agnes came in 67. I named her for my mother, as I had promised myself I would if given a daughter. Thomas Jr. was born in 1868 and died in the winter of 1870 from croup. He was 3 years old, and it was the first great sorrow of my married life. A sorrow I do not believe ever entirely leaves you. Caroline was born in 71 and lived a good age. Robert came in 73 and lived only 4 months before a summer fever carried him away. He was so small, and that summer was fierce. Henry was born in 75. Ruth came in 77, a particularly bright child, quick and fond of reading, reminding me of my mother. She died of diphtheria in 1882 at 5 years of age. I do not speak of that lightly. Mabel, our youngest, born in 1880, survived and has been a considerable comfort to me in later years. 5 of our 8 children reached adulthood. 3 we buried. Thomas bore each loss with a fortitude I tried to match, though I cannot say I always succeeded. The loss of Ruth, especially. That one took a long time to bear without being broken by it. I am strained from my father. That is perhaps natural. There is more pleasure in speaking of Thomas and our children than of Elias Proctor, and the mind inclines toward what is pleasant. But the question was asked about my father, and I will not avoid it. My mother died in autumn 1867. She was 53 and had not been well for some time. A weakness in her constitution was attributed by physicians to her heart. I have my own view on what contributed to her weakness, though I doubt it would satisfy a doctor. I was a young wife and mother then, with Agnes not yet walking, and I visited my mother's house as often as the 8-mile journey, and my own household allowed. I was with her in her final days. I sat beside her bed for 4 days and nights. My father was in the house, but not in a way that truly mattered. He sat in the parlor, attended to his letters, came to the doorway occasionally to ask about her condition, and when told nothing had changed, returned to the parlor. On the second night, when she was visibly failing, I told him plainly that he ought to sit with her, that she should not pass with only her daughter and the hired girl near her daughter. He looked at me with an expression I have never fully forgotten, not unkind, but distant, as though what I suggested was a serious inconvenience, and he said he would look in shortly. He came at last on the 3rd morning, sat beside her bed for perhaps a quarter of an hour. She could no longer speak. She died that evening, and he was not present. I was that quarter of an hour. I have reflected on it many times over the 63 years since. What does a man owe the woman he has lived beside for 30 years? What does he owe her at the last? I cannot answer in general terms, only what I observed. What I observed was a man who thought the sickness of his wife of 30 years required a mere quarter hour of his presence. I do not know fully what passed in their private marriage. I know what I observed and what my mother told me in her later years. She was not one to complain, yet in those final years, when her health declined and life slowed enough for reflection, she spoke more openly than before. Not bitterly, that was remarkable, the thing that made it hard to hear. She spoke with a sadness that had become almost acceptance, a sadness long present, so that it was merely the texture of her existence, like the creek's sound or the winter cold. She said she had hoped for many years that my father might change, and each relapse she believed the next improvement might be permanent. She prayed diligently for his reformation, and in her later years accepted that it would not come, and made her peace with God if not with the circumstances. Near the end I asked if she wished she had done anything differently. She was silent for a long while, then said plainly, "I had no different choices available to me." Nellie, she was correct. A woman of her era and circumstances had no other choices. The Lord did not provide them. Society did not. She bore what she bore, because there was no other path, and she bore it with dignity. That I have spent most of my life trying to emulate. My father remarried in the spring of 1868, 6 months, and a few weeks after my mother's burial. He married a woman named Hester, considerably younger than he was, perhaps 20 years or so, a widow from the northern part of the county. I did not attend the wedding. I wrote him a letter saying I would not go, and I explained as clearly as a daughter could, without completely breaking ties, my reasons. He did not answer, or if he did, the answer was so general it hardly counted. Nathan agreed with my view. He was more forceful about it than I was, and he and my father exchanged words. I was not present to witness. Calvin, I think, had made his peace with it. Calvin was more accommodating than Nathan or I, and Ida was young enough that the second marriage hurt her far less than it hurt us. What I found almost unbearable was not just the quickness of the remarriage, not only the difference in their ages, but the implication, which I think was entirely accurate, that my mother had been for Elias Proctor a position to be filled, rather than a person to be mourned, that her death had been, in the main, an administrative matter needing a replacement. I saw my father several times in the following years. We were not entirely estranged. There were family events, and Nathan's children and Ida's children had attachments to their grandfather that I did not want to sever because of my own grievances. I went to Christmas and Thanksgiving at his house when Thomas agreed, which he always did. Thomas never allowed my difficulties with my father to become his own, which was generous of him. I sat at my father's tea, Abel, and watched him with Hester, who, truthfully, was a perfectly adequate woman, not unpleasant, not unkind, with no obvious faults I could name. She had done nothing to deserve my coldness, and I tried not to be unjust, though I cannot claim to have been warm. She married a man the community respected, and she likely had no knowledge of the private history of his household. He prospered. He continued to prosper, year after year, while my mother lay in the county cemetery, and her suffering faded from view to everyone but her children. That is the particular injustice that has weighed on me longest, and I speak with a feeling I have carried for 60 years, so I ask pardon if it shows too plainly here. He was well regarded in Zanesville. The men at the Mechanics' Institute respected him. When county histories were written, Elias Proctor was mentioned favorably. He donated a large sum to a new church building in the 1880s, and his name was placed on a stone by the entrance. He died in February of 1898, at the age of 88, the same age as I reckon myself now. His obituary in the Zanesville paper described him as a man of sterling character and faithful service to his community. I read it, set it down on the parlor table, and sat for a long while looking out at the field. Thomas, who noticed more than he often said, came and sat beside me quietly. We stayed like that for half an hour before either of us moved. I visited my father once in his final years, around 1896, I believe. He was unwell, and the family thought a visit proper, so I went with Thomas. By then he was bedridden, much diminished from the large, well-dressed man I had known in childhood. The visit lasted about an hour. He spoke about the store, which a nephew managed, about Washington affairs, about various grandchildren and their activities. He did not speak of my mother, did not speak of my childhood, did not ask if he had treated his family as he should have, did not ask my forgiveness. He may not have believed there was anything to forgive. Perhaps he genuinely thought himself the man his obituary described, a man of sterling character, and the gap between that view and reality was invisible to him. I have pondered this for many years. It is troubling to think he may not have known what he had done, or that he knew and did not see why acknowledgement was needed. Several devout acquaintances have suggested this earnestly, citing scripture as they do. I am a woman of faith, have attended church all my life, have read the Bible cover to cover many times, and I know what I believe. I do not dispute that forgiveness is required. I understand the theology. I have sat in pews for 8 decades, heard many sermons, and found no fault in the scripture itself. What I have never reconciled is what exactly is being forgiven. My father never admitted wrongdoing, never acted as a man seeking to make amends. The forgiveness I was asked to give was therefore offered without any request. It was forgiveness extended to a man who, as far as I could see, did not think he had done anything to require it. In my mid-50s, perhaps after Thomas died, I tried deliberately. I sat in the parlor on a winter evening and prayed earnestly, asking for the grace to let go, to see my father as a flawed man shaped by circumstances, rather than a man who willfully erred. I sat for a long time, and what I found was not forgiveness, but a cold understanding, the recognition that he was who he was, and that his being that way caused my mother's suffering, a fact that would remain true regardless of my feelings. Whether that is forgiveness or only its likeness, I do not know. Ministers, I have asked, offer no certainty, turning to theology, which is not always practical. I have met people who forgive, without being asked, of greater spiritual capacity or a different temperament, and I cannot always distinguish. I know women who forgave husbands who ruined them, men who forgave fathers who abandoned them, people who could release grievances that were legitimate. I do not say they were legitimate. Perhaps they found peace, I have not. But I have never managed that act. I cannot make my mother's suffering as if it never happened. I cannot undo the nights I lay awake as a child, hearing my father's voice through the parlor floor. She existed, endured, deserved better. That is true. True things do not vanish with passing years. In the end, what I have done, after much reflection over decades, is set him down. I do not know if that is forgiveness or something near it. Ministers and theologians have offered many opinions, which I have listened to patiently. By setting him down, I mean I stopped expecting him to be what he was not. I stopped needing him to admit his faults. I stopped waiting for a conversation that would never happen. That release of expectation came in time, and it was not nothing. It allowed me to live without being wholly occupied by his failures. My life was not entirely embittered by him. I want to make that clear. I had Thomas, my children and grandchildren, and enough work to occupy every season. Life passed with ordinary griefs and pleasures. October mornings had light across the fields that almost explained the whole enterprise of living. Winters were full of grandchildren, and the sound was remarkable. My life was not bitter throughout, but the forgiveness that transforms a wound into a lesson, that turns grievance into purpose, that I have not achieved, not in 8 decades and more of trying and not trying. Nathan once said something to me shortly before he died. We were on his porch in summer 1920, both of us very old, having I have reached the age at which one can speak plainly about things carried for 50 years because there is no longer any real reason to spare one another. He said, "Nellie, do you think Father ever really knew who he was?" I told him I did not know. I told him I had spent a large portion of my life pondering that very question. Nathan was quiet for a while. He had grown accustomed to long silences in his later years, perhaps shaped by the war, and then he said, "I do not think he did." He said it without anger, simply as a conclusion reached after much thought. I think he looked into the mirror and saw the man at the Mechanics' Institute, the man whose name is etched on the church door. I believe that is all he ever saw. I have turned Nathan's words over in my mind many times since he passed. I cannot be certain he was right. but I cannot be certain he was wrong either. And that uncertainty carries its own small burden. There was a minister in our county when I was younger, a man named Ferris, I believe, though I cannot be certain of his name, who preached that the hardest work of a Christian life was not suffering, but seeing clearly. Not endurance, he said, but clear sight, seeing yourself, seeing others, seeing the world as it truly is, rather than as you wish it to be, or as others have persuaded you it must be. I have thought of that sermon often across the decades. My mother saw clearly, I believe. She saw my father as he was, and she bore what she saw with remarkable fortitude, never allowing it to make her cruel, petty, or unkind toward the rest of the world. That is the example I have tried to follow. I have not always succeeded in seeing without bitterness. I have not always kept a line between truthful observation and uncharitable judgment, but I have tried, and I believe my mother would have said she was always generous with her view of me, perhaps more generous than I deserved. She would have said the tiara's enough. The turn of the century from 1899 into 1900, I remember that night fairly clearly, though memory can be unreliable in its details. Thomas and I were at home, as we usually were in the evenings, and several of our children and grandchildren had come by, for it seemed a night worth marking. We stayed up past midnight, which was not our custom, and when the new century arrived, when we were, as Thomas said, standing in the year 1900, I felt something hard to describe, not merely the arithmetic, though that was part of it. I had been born in 1842. My grandfather was born before the century we were leaving. My mother's grandmother was born when the nation itself was new. I stood at the threshold of a new century and thought, how many years of human struggle are contained in what I have witnessed alone, and how many more in what my mother saw, and her mother before her, and backward through all the women of our family, who bore what they bore without anyone asking whether it was fair or necessary. That thought stayed with me in the early hours of the new century, and long afterward. Thomas died in 193. I have not spoken much of his passing because this account concerns my father, but I cannot mention loss without acknowledging him. I would not do Thomas the disservice of leaving him out. He was sick with pneumonia through most of February, and died on the 21st. I will say only that 39 years of marriage had not lessened my regard for him in any way. I missed him deeply, and I still do, though I have grown accustomed to it, in the way one grows accustomed to a missing finger. The absence becomes ordinary and permanent. I am 88 years old. I will turn 89 this coming spring, if I am spared. My father died at 88, the same age at which I speak to you now. There is something in that coincidence I have noted, though I do not know what to make of it. Whether it means anything or is mere arithmetic, I cannot say. Perhaps it is just arithmetic. Most things I have found are just arithmetic is the end, and the meaning we find is what we place there ourselves out of habit. My mother saw significance in things. She was more inclined than I to read providence in the details of life. I am less so. Thomas was much less so, and perhaps I took some of that from 39 years beside him. He was practical. He found meaning in things themselves, in the mill running smoothly, the harvest arriving before the rain, the children growing, the ordinary succession of days. There was something admirable in that, something I have tried to carry forward. My father was a tall man, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, and he filled a room with authority. As a small child, I thought him very important indeed, as children do for those who care for them. I sat on his knee when I was 4 or 5, before I could understand him fully, and I believed him to be the most capable man in the world. Children give that belief freely, often without evidence, and most parents do not deserve it. My father did not deserve it at all. Yet I must be honest. I do not know what shaped him. I do not know what his father was to him, what his boyhood contained, or what first drove him to the bottle and sharp words. I know nothing of what occurred before I could observe. It is possible, I will concede this because honesty requires it, that he was formed by circumstances that would have made many men worse than he was, and what I witnessed was, perhaps, an improvement on what he might have been. I do not know. I do. BT it, but I cannot say for certain it is not so. The impossibility of that certainty is part of why I have never closed the matter fully in my heart. You cannot fully condemn what you cannot fully explain, and I cannot fully explain my father. And there it remains. I expect to see him again when my time comes. What he will say, and what I will reply, I cannot guess. I have thought on it at length in the long evenings of these last years, when there is little to do but think and remember. Perhaps in that other place the accounting will differ, and the things that seemed heavy here will seem lighter, and the settled things will seem open. I do not know. I have made my peace with not knowing. I have tried to make peace with most things over 88 years, with varying success. That is my answer to my granddaughter's question. I am sorry it is not what she hoped for. She is a kind young woman, and wished I had found comfort in forgiveness. Perhaps she will forgive me for not having done so. That would be a fine irony, I think. An old woman who could not forgive her father, forgiven by her granddaughter for that very failure. It would please me. My father, I do not think, would have understood the irony. He never cared for such things. I am tired now, and my eyes are not what they once were. I have said all I have to say.